a deep, resonant vibration beneath the polished fluorite floorboards. That was how the end of the Lumari sovereignty announced itself within the grand auditory chambers of the Concordance of Suns. As a junior scribe in the third tier, my primary function was to document the exact chromatic shifts of our elders as they spoke, capturing the emotional resonance of their light-emitting skin for the historical archives. I was trained to look for the subtle pinks of diplomacy, the sharp yellows of economic dispute, and the cool blues of scientific inquiry. Today, the entire Lumari delegation pulsed in a sickly, pallid violet. It was the color of terminal distress. The color a Lumari turns just before their secondary hearts stop beating. The Ashen swarm mind had already consumed 6 of our outer sectors within a single lunar cycle. The reports from the border colonies were not merely accounts of military defeat. They were ecological obituaries. The Ashen did not conquer territory to govern it. It digested it. Entire planetary crusts stripped of essential silicates. Atmospheres siphoned into massive, orbiting void bladders. Whole populations broken down into base proteins and complex hydrocarbons to feed the ever-expanding biological architecture of the hive. The assembly hall was a masterpiece of zero-gravity engineering, a vast, spherical amphitheater filled with floating podiums woven from spun light and magnetic currents. The gelatinous ambassadors of the Ul floated in reinforced containment spheres, their internal fluids churning and bubbling with visible agitation. The avian dignitaries of the crawl perched on high-altitude acceleration couches, their iridescent feathers puffed outward in a desperate, instinctual display of aggression that fooled absolutely no one. They were prey trying to look large. And then, there was the Terran remnant. High Chancellor Alara Thorn did not float on a dais of hard light. She did not pulse with warning colors or puff her plumage. She sat on the lowest floor level, isolated by a wide perimeter of empty space, occupying a piece of furniture she had explicitly required her aides to carry from her own vessel. A simple, unadorned wooden chair. The grain of the dead terrestrial flora was worn smooth and dark at the armrests from decades of friction. It was a glaring, almost insulting low-tech anomaly amidst the glowing anti-grav technology of the galactic elite. To the Concordance, the Terrans were a minor, slightly embarrassing curiosity. They were perceived as a primitive, heavily localized merchant species, useful only for hauling low-value ore and biological waste across the hazardous, radiation-soaked nebulae that older species avoided. They had no standing army on record. They possessed no dreadnoughts. They had spent the last 200 standard years trading quietly, politely yielding in every border dispute, and accepting unfavorable tariffs with a placid, almost cow-like docility. Prelate Vexus, the elder of my caste, drifted to the central speaking node. His bioluminescence was flickering wildly, a sign of severe circulatory distress and oxygen deprivation. He was begging. The translation matrix overhead struggled to convert his frantic, highly complex light patterns into standard audio for the non-visual species, emitting a faint, rhythmic hum. That mechanical hum was a sound I would memorize, etching it into my auditory cortex. It was the sound of a machine failing to capture the absolute terror of a dying species. Vexus pleaded for military intervention. He offered mining rights, indentured servitude, our most sacred technological schematics. The crawl turned their beaks away, adjusting their flight harnesses. The old deliberately darkened the opacity of their spheres. No one would risk their pristine fleets against the endless, gnashing teeth of the Ashen collective. No one, except the merchants. The council, desperate to offer a gesture of solidarity without committing a single drop of their own blood, formally requested that the Terran remnant provide civilian transport vessels. An evacuation effort. A grand, hollow gesture of logistical charity. I must confess something before the archival seal locks on this record. What I witnessed in the cycles that followed wasn't the salvation of my people, but the death of our innocence. Thorn remained entirely motionless as the formal decree of the Concordance was translated. The translation matrix continued its rhythmic, failing tune, struggling now to process the Terran's micro-expressions. Humans were notoriously difficult for the matrix to read. They lacked chromatic skin to display their neurochemistry, pheromone vents to broadcast their aggression, or articulating crests to signal submission. They just stared. Thorn's gaze remained fixed on the center of the hall, her hands resting lightly on the smooth wooden armrests of her chair. Her breathing did not accelerate. "The Terran remnant acknowledges the request of the Concordance," Thorn said. Her voice was entirely flat, devoid of the complex, multi-layered harmonics my species used to convey empathy or sorrow. She lifted her right arm slowly. A heavy, archaic metal cuff encircled her wrist, completely devoid of holographic interfaces. She pressed a mechanical, physical depression on the cuff. "Protocol authorization. Edict terminus. Recall all assets." A ripple of profound confusion passed through the assembly. Edict terminus meant nothing to the translation matrix. It outputted a string of nonsensical syntax errors on my data slate. "We will provide mercy to the Lamari," Thorn continued, standing up. The wooden chair scraped slightly against the fluorite floor, a harsh, primitive sound that momentarily drowned out the ambient hum of the anti-grav engines. She looked directly at Prelate Vexus, her eyes locking onto his flickering form. "However, I must issue a formal advisory to the Concordance. The mercy we are about to deploy will be profoundly unsafe for any civilian to witness. I strongly suggest your surviving populace keep their visual receptors shielded." She turned and walked out of the chamber. She did not wait for a formal dismissal. She did not wait for a response from the High Council. The heavy, rhythmic thud of her kinetic boots against the floorboards sounded like a countdown. In the agonizing cycles that followed, the shattered remnants of the Lamari fleet retreated to our home system, forming a fragile, desperate defensive ring around our primary star. I was stationed on the high-orbit archive station above our capital world, tasked with backing up our entire cultural history into deep space transmission pods before the Ashen swarm arrived. The proximity sensors screamed a continuous, high-pitched wail. The gravitational displacement of the approaching hive mind was already tearing the outer moons from their orbits. And then, the Terrans arrived. They did not slip out of hyperspace with the elegant, silent grace of the crawl vessels. They tore a ragged hole in the local space-time continuum, bleeding hard radiation and violently displacing the local kinetic fields. The visual sensor arrays on my station overloaded for 3 agonizing seconds before resolving the image. They were massive, bloated, inexplicably ugly. Thousands of standard Terran bulk freighters dropped into the system. Their hulls were patched with mismatched shades of gray and brown metal, trailing thick, dirty exhaust plumes like ancient industrial chimneys from a forgotten era. They moved sluggishly, their thrusters firing with unsynchronized bursts as they took up positions slightly ahead of the Lamari defensive line. I stared at my monitor, my own bioluminescence pulsing in a confused, muted yellow. They were sending bulk freighters to a frontline siege, which meant the Terrans simply didn't understand the scale of the... My thoughts shattered entirely. The Ashen vanguard, a writhing, chaotic mass of biomechanical ships that looked like a plague of iron locusts, breached the system's edge. The Terran freighters did not move. They did not broadcast a surrender code. They did not initiate evacuation protocols. They simply hung there in the void, a silent wall of scrap metal standing between a dying species and total consumption. The frantic tension in the archive room evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, sickening certainty. This was their mercy. A few thousand slow, unarmored cargo ships functioning as a momentary physical barricade. We were already dead. The primary swarm reached the Terran line. I braced for the slaughter, my bioluminescence fading to the pale, ashen gray of total resignation. We watched the tactical feed on the main orbital displays, a massive, curving wall of hard light that dominated the archive station. The Ashen vanguard was a writhing, chaotic mass of biomechanical horrors. They resembled a plague of iron locusts, their hulls formed from calcified bone and scavenged hull plating, driven by pulsing, exposed bioreactors. They moved with a terrifying, fluid synchronicity, anticipating each other's vectors with the flawless processing power of a billion connected minds. We expected the fragile, mismatched Terran metal boxes to crumple instantly under the sheer kinetic mass of the swarm. Instead, the cargo ships began to disintegrate. It was not a structural failure. It was a perfectly synchronized, mechanical sequence. Massive sections of their outer plating detached, the explosive bolts firing in a silent, rippling sequence across thousands of vessels simultaneously. They vented thick, blinding clouds of localized atmosphere and freezing coolant into the hard vacuum of space, obscuring the visual sensors for several agonizing seconds. The shed metal drifted outward, creating a temporary, spinning debris field of discarded shells. My monitors struggled to parse the sudden, catastrophic spike in energy signatures. The telemetry data scrolled in rapid, nonsensical bursts of red warnings. If the hulls were peeling away, then the mass of the ships hadn't changed. It had just been hiding me. The coolant fog cleared, and the true Terran fleet emerged. Underneath the molted scrap, they were pitch black and featureless, completely devoid of the elegant, sweeping curves or glowing propulsion rings favored by the Concordance. They were brutally angular, designed not for the beauty of transit, but for the cold, mathematical efficiency of slaughter. They were predators in masks. From the center of the formation, a monstrous, wedge-shaped dreadnought designated the Iron Aegis took point. War Master Kalen Jax initiated the combat sequence, broadcasting the telemetry on an open, unencrypted channel. It was an act of supreme arrogance. They wanted the Concordance to see. Hidden vents along the black hulls dilated, bleeding off the immense, blinding thermal bloom of main reactors spinning up from their 200-year slumber. The silence inside the archive station was absolute as we watched the feed, not a single scribe daring to even regulate their breathing. The Terrans did not fire superheated plasma or elegant beams of concentrated photons. They relied on the oldest, most brutal laws of physics. They fired solid, hyperdense kinetic slugs from railgun batteries that spanned the entire length of their ships. The projectiles moved at significant fractions of light speed, completely invisible to the naked eye. The Ashen vanguard was not just stopped, it was structurally pulverized before their hive mind could even register the impact warning. The sheer kinetic transfer tore the biomechanical ships into ragged shreds of flash-frozen organic matter and twisted metal. The impact tremors vibrated through the subspace network, shaking the very foundations of our orbital platform. Then came the deployment of the molecular Bonterror, a silent, rippling distortion wave emitted from the forward pylons of the Aegis. It bent the starlight around it as it expanded, looking like a ripple across a dark pond. When it washed over the Ashen flagship, a leviathan the size of a small moon, the creature did not burn, nor did it shatter. It simply unraveled. Its dense organic armor, its massive propulsion bladders, its neural processing cores, all dissolved into a vast, expanding cloud of base component atoms. The collective collapse was instantaneous. Without their central processing node to direct the neural traffic, the remaining swarm ships went mad. They crashed into each other, firing blindly into the void, before eventually drifting helplessly, dead and inert in the freezing vacuum. The great devourers of the galaxy, the unstoppable plague that had consumed 6 sectors, had been reduced to atomic dust in less than 4 standard minutes. Terran boarding parties launched in utter silence, their sleek black dropships moving like ghosts to secure the remaining debris and take custody of any surviving bioforms. Hours later, the emergency session of the Concordance reconvened. The atmosphere in the grand auditory chamber was fundamentally altered. The Kral dignitaries were shivering, their iridescent feathers slicked tight against their bodies in a display of primal, involuntary submission. The Yol ambassadors had sunk to the very bottom of their containment spheres, their internal fluids entirely still and murky with dread. When High Chancellor Thorn returned to the chamber, she did not look triumphant. She looked incredibly tired, carrying a sorrow that my translation matrix could not even begin to quantify. She walked across the fluorite floor, her kinetic boots striking the ground with a heavy, rhythmic finality that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She returned to the center of the room, standing beside the piece of furniture she had insisted on bringing. She ran her fingers lightly along the worn, polished grain of the simple wooden chair she had brought, the friction of centuries smoothing the armrests where countless Terran leaders had anchored their anxiety while fighting the urge to revert to the old ways of war. She sat down slowly, the joints of the chair creaking loudly in the vast, terrified silence of the assembly. "You mistook our choice for our capacity," Thorn said, looking up at the assembly. Her voice was just as flat, just as devoid of our complex, multi-layered harmonics as before, but it now carried the crushing weight of a shattered galactic paradigm. We endured our isolation, choosing peace not out of weakness, but because we bear the ancestral scars of our own design. We know exactly what we are capable of. We didn't forget how to be monsters. We just decided to be neighbors. She leaned forward, her dark eyes sweeping across the suspended podiums of the alien elite. You asked us for a rescue fleet. But when a Terran offers mercy, they aren't saving the victims. They're ending the threat. The galactic power structure fractured permanently in that profound, suffocating silence. Below the suspended, trembling podiums of the elites, the primitive wooden chair no longer looked like an embarrassing relic of a lesser species. It sat securely anchored to the fluorite floor like a throne of dormant violence, its dark grain holding the terrible weight of a restrained apocalypse.